The hum of the fluorescent lights above Reid's desk was a constant, dull drone, a soundtrack to his meticulously organized life. He pushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead, his gaze fixed on the spreadsheet before him. Rows of data, columns of figures, a predictable, controllable world. He found comfort in the rigid logic, the unambiguous answers. Outside his window, the city pulsed with its own relentless rhythm, but here, within the sterile confines of his office, everything was ordered. He adjusted the angle of his monitor, the faint scent of recycled air conditioning a familiar companion. A tap on his open doorframe broke the quiet. "Reid? You have a visitor." He looked up to see a colleague, a lean woman with kind eyes, gesturing towards the reception area. Reid rarely had visitors, especially not during work hours. He felt a prickle of unease, a tiny crack in the day's routine. "Who is it?" "A solicitor, apparently. Says it's urgent." "Solicitor." The word hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Reid's family was small, almost non-existent. He knew of no legal entanglements. With a sigh, he saved his work, the click of the mouse unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of his thoughts. He walked towards the reception, his polished shoes making soft thuds on the carpet. He introduced himself, then wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mr. Reid, Reid regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Alastair Finch." He was a distant relative, Reid understand. Alastair Finch. The name was a ghost from a half-forgotten family tree, a branch that withered before Reid was born. He remembered a faded photograph, perhaps, or a hushed mention from his grandmother long ago. He barely knew the man. "Passed away?" Reid asked, the words feeling clumsy. "How?" The solicitor's expression remained unreadable. "The circumstances were unclear. Suffice it to say, it was sudden. And quite remote." He pushed a thick manila folder across the polished reception desk. "Mr. Finch left no immediate heirs. You, Mr. Reid, are his closest living kin. He bequeathed to you his entire estate, including his primary residence." Reid picked up the folder. The paper felt cool beneath his fingertips. Estate. Residence. The words conjured images of quaint cottages or suburban houses, not the remote implication in the solicitor's voice. "Where is this residence?" "Deep in the Blackwood Forest. A cabin, to be precise. Quite secluded." The solicitor's voice dropped slightly, a barely perceptible shift in tone. "It's been in the Finch line for generations. An old place. Very old." The information settled over Reid like a shroud. An inheritance from a relative he didn't know, a cabin in a forgotten forest, a mysterious death. It felt like the opening lines of a story he had no desire to star in. Yet, a strange pull, a morbid curiosity, began to stir beneath his practiced composure. He took the documents, thanked the solicitor, and returned to his desk, the hum of the lights now sounding less like comfort and more like a low, insistent thrum. The decision to go was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The cabin, Alastair Finch's last legacy, pulsed in his thoughts like an unfinished chord. He spent a week meticulously preparing, arranging for time off, packing only essentials. He researched the area, finding old, fragmented maps and vague mentions of the Blackwood Forest's impenetrable depths. The drive was long, the asphalt ribbon slowly unraveling from multi-lane highways to single, winding tracks. The urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills, then to an increasingly dense canopy of trees. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The forest pressed in, an endless green wall on either side, the sun struggling to pierce the thick foliage. Eventually, the GPS signal sputtered, then died. Reid relied on the crumpled printouts he'd brought, following landmarks. An hour later, a dilapidated sign for a weather station appeared through a gap in the trees. He pulled off the narrow track onto a gravel patch beside a small, weather-beaten structure. The paint was peeling, and the metal instruments on the roof looked corroded and forgotten. He saw a flicker of movement within the small building. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of unseen leaves and the faint, high whistle of the wind through the tall pines. He walked to the door of the weather station and pushed it open. Inside, a man sat hunched over a radio console, its dials glowing faintly. He had a grizzled beard and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the forest itself. "Lost your way?" the attendant asked. His voice raspy, without looking up from the static-laced broadcast. "Looking for the Finch cabin," Reid said, holding up a faded map. "It should be. Just past here?" The attendant finally lifted his gaze. His eyes, the color of moss, fixing on Reid. "That's what they call it." "Not anymore." He paused, then added, "Old man Finch," he kept to himself. "Always did." He offered no further explanation, just a long, unsettling stare before turning back to his radio. The encounter left Reid feeling profoundly unsettled. He thanked the attendant, his voice sounding thin in the sudden quiet, and returned to his car. The road beyond the weather station was little more than two muddy ruts, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. The trees here were ancient, their branches intertwined overhead, forming a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. He navigated slowly, the car lurching over unseen roots and stones. Then, through a narrow break in the dense foliage, he saw it. The cabin. Overgrown vines clawed at the walls, and a thick carpet of moss coated the porch. It wasn't a quaint inheritance, it was a derelict sentinel, brooding and forgotten. The air was still, heavy, and carried a faint, sweet sickly odor he couldn't quite place, like decaying leaves mingled with something metallic. He felt watched, not by a specific gaze, but by the collective, ancient weight of the forest itself. He approached the cabin, each step on the leaf-strewn path feeling impossibly loud. The porch groaned beneath his weight. The wooden door, warped and gray, was unlocked. He pushed it open, a cloud of dust puffing out into the dim light. A single shaft of weak sunlight pierced a grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes and the ghostly shapes of old, draped furniture. And then, a sound, so faint he almost dismissed it as his imagination, a soft, rhythmic scratching, coming from somewhere within the walls, like tiny claws dragging across old wood. He was not alone here. And he was very far from the predictable order of his life. The attendant's words, heavy with unspoken warnings, clung to Reid like the damp forest air as his truck rumbled away from the small, ramshackle weather station. The structure, a collection of corrugated metal and antennas perched precariously on a rise, seemed to watch him recede into the deepening shadows of the tree line. The path ahead narrowed, two rutted tracks barely discernible beneath a canopy of gnarled branches that clawed at the fading light. He gripped the steering wheel, the determination that had propelled him this far hardening his jaw. Finch's cabin awaited, a forgotten inheritance, and Reid had come too far to be deterred by local folklore or the lingering unease of a stranger. The last few miles were a brutal test of his suspension. Branches scraped against the truck's paint, and the tires slipped in slick mud, each lurch a reminder of the cabin's isolation. When the towering pines finally thinned, revealing a clearing, Reid stopped the truck. Before him, nestled amongst ancient oaks, stood the cabin. It wasn't merely old, it felt ancient. Its logs, dark with age and weather, sagged inwards, and the single chimney leaned precariously. The windows, thick with grime, were like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of moss. He cut the engine. The sudden absence of noise was jarring. Stepping out, he inhaled deeply. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth. And something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old iron or distant rain on stone. The porch groaned under his weight, each step a protest from the decaying wood. The door swung inward, releasing a wave of stale, musty air that smelled of dust, decay, and something unidentifiable, like dried herbs or forgotten spices. Moonlight, weak and filtered through the grimy windows, cast long, wavering fingers across the main room. Dust motes danced in the faint light, a swirling, silent ballet. Reid flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing a space choked with cobwebs and the ghosts of a lifelong past. He spent the first few hours methodically opening windows, letting the cooler night air attempt to scour away the decades of neglect. He moved furniture, pushing aside sheets draped over lumpy forms, stirring up clouds of fine powder. A persistent creaking began, a rhythmic complaint from the floorboards above him, or perhaps the settling timber of the old house. He paused, listening. Wind, he rationalized, finding purchase in some unseen crack. Or just the house, groaning under its own weight after so many years of stillness. Later, while attempting to clear a small, rickety desk by the hearth, a faint scratching sound emanated from the wall behind it. It was a delicate, almost hesitant scrape, like fingernails against wood, or a small rodent gnawing. Reid froze, his hand hovering over a stack of yellowed papers. He waited, his breath held. Nothing. He shook his head, a small, humorless chuckle escaping him. Mice, he thought, definitely mice. The isolation was already making him jumpy. He returned to the desk, sorting through old letters and faded photographs. They stood in front of a cabin that was undeniably this one, though in a better state of repair. As dusk deepened into true night, he set about unpacking some essentials. He carried a box of supplies into the small, cramped kitchen, setting it on a counter thick with dust. He turned to retrieve a cleaning cloth from his bag, and when he looked back, a small, porcelain figurine of a bird, which he distinctly remembered seeing on a high, dusty shelf in the living room, now sat precisely in the center of the kitchen counter. He was certain he hadn't touched it, hadn't even been near that shelf since he first walked in. He walked back to the living room, shining his light up to the shelf. Empty. He returned to the kitchen, picking up the figurine. It felt cool, smooth, utterly innocuous. He told himself he must have moved it, unconsciously, perhaps, in his initial sweep of the room. Fatigue, he decided, was playing tricks. He put the bird back on the shelf in the living room, this time making a conscious effort to note its position. The thought lingered, however, a tiny, sharp burr beneath the surface of his composure. He tried to dismiss it, focusing on the task of making the cabin remotely habitable. He was determined to see this through, to understand what Finch had left behind. He found it tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, almost hidden by a thin layer of grime. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages brittle. No title, no author. Just a series of intricate, almost obsessive carvings etched into the leather itself, forming a swirling, organic pattern that seemed to writhe beneath his fingertips. He pulled it out, a cloud of ancient dust puffing around it. He opened it carefully. The script within was a cramped, elegant hand, the ink faded to sepia. The first few pages were mundane entries about weather and crops, but then the tone shifted. There were sketches of strange symbols, jagged lines, and then, a passage that made the hair on his arms rise, the old ways stir. The earth remembers its tribute. It rippled, briefly forming a shape that seemed too tall, too thin, before dissolving back into the static gloom. Reid's breath hitched. He wasn't tired. He wasn't imagining things. This cabin held secrets, and something within its walls was beginning to stir. The shadow, a blot of deeper night against the already dim wall, elongated with a deliberate stretch, not like a trick of the light but with an undeniable, malevolent intent. Reid's breath hitched, caught in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. He watched, frozen, as the distortion flowed, not quite solid, not quite gas, until it receded, melting back into the corner from which it had sprung. For a long moment, only the frantic beat of his own pulse filled the room. He swallowed, a dry rasp in his throat. He closed his eyes, then opened them again, forcing himself to scan the corner. Nothing. Just the peeling wallpaper and the dust motes dancing in the meager light. That night, sleep was a battlefield. He heard it first as a subtle shift, the creak of floorboards in the empty hallway, too heavy to be the settling of an old house. He sat bolt upright, straining to listen, but they would vanish the moment he focused, leaving only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines outside. He rationalized it as the wind, as branches scraping the roof, as an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. But when he found his grandfather's old compass, previously tucked away in a drawer, lying open on his bedside table, its needle spinning wildly despite the absence of any magnetic field, the rationalizations began to crumble. The phenomena didn't cease, they escalated. The cabin, once merely old and isolated, became actively hostile. Objects would shift, a book falling from a shelf with a soft thud when no one was near, a teacup sliding inches across the kitchen counter, leaving a faint trail of condensation. The metallic tang became a constant companion, sometimes so potent it burned the back of his throat. He'd spin around, his heart lurching, only to find an empty doorway, a still curtain. He was losing sleep. His skin crawled. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, an invisible pressure that settled on his shoulders, tightening with each passing hour. This was deliberate. This was active. Reid knew he couldn't stay there without understanding. He needed answers, and he knew they wouldn't be found by waiting. He started with the cabin itself, meticulously searching through dusty attics and crawlspaces. He found old ledgers, brittle with age, detailing property lines and timber harvests, but nothing about the land's deeper history. No mention of pacts, no strange occurrences. It was as if the man had deliberately avoided the subject, or perhaps, simply hadn't known. His research led him away from the cabin, down the winding, overgrown logging roads towards the nearest small settlement. The general store, a relic of a bygone era, offered little beyond canned goods and wary glances from the proprietor, an elderly man whose eyes held a deep, unreadable knowledge. Reid asked about the cabin, about the land, about any old stories. The proprietor merely grunted, polishing a worn counter, suggesting he look at the town's historical archives. The archives were housed in a small, forgotten building near the edge of town, adjacent to what the locals called the weather station. The station itself was a collection of rusting instruments and a small, squat brick structure, long disused. Inside the archive, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. An older woman, the local archivist, her spectacles perched on her nose, gave him access to brittle maps and yellowed newspaper clippings. He spent hours poring over documents, tracing the cabin's lineage through property deeds. The land, he discovered, had been continuously owned by his family for generations, stretching back into the early 19th century. Not an explicit confession, but a series of cryptic entries, written in a cramped, almost illegible hand. One entry, dated October 1787, stood out, the ink faded but the words stark, "A life for the land," to quiet the stirring. The metallic tang seemed to flood his mouth, and the air in the quiet archive grew heavy, suffocating. He recognized the symbol. He'd seen it faintly carved into one of the ancient, weather-beaten beams in the cabin's foundation, almost entirely obscured by moss and time. His family hadn't merely inherited a cabin, they had inherited a debt. And the entity that demanded payment was stirring. He closed the journal, the weight of generations pressing down on him, and felt an invisible gaze bore into his back, even here, miles from the cabin. This was real. He backed away slowly, one hand reaching for the rough wood of the doorframe, his fingers scraping against splinters. His mind raced, desperate for an answer, a thread to pull. Then, a memory surfaced, a faint flicker from his initial exploration of the cabin. It wasn't a detailed survey, just a few landmarks, the cabin, the creek, and a dotted line leading deeper into the woods, terminating at a symbol he'd dismissed as an abstract doodle. The symbol, he realized, was a stylized weather vane. A weather station. The thought pulled at him, a desperate, illogical hope. Perhaps there, away from the cabin's immediate grip, he might find something, anything, that offered a clue. He snatched his jacket, the cold air already seeping into his bones, and practically fled the cabin, the metallic tang chasing him down the steps. The forest was a labyrinth of ancient, gnarled trees, their branches skeletal against the bruised evening sky. The metallic taste in his mouth persisted, a constant, sickening reminder. After what felt like an eternity, scrambling over roots and through thickets, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a clearing. In its center, a skeletal structure of rusted metal rose against the twilight, the weather station. It was more ruin than edifice, a forgotten sentinel. A broken anemometer spun lazily in the faint breeze, a mournful squeal its only sound. The small, prefabricated building beside it was a mess of peeling paint and shattered windows, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust. He pushed open the sagging door of the building, which groaned in protest, sending a cascade of dust and loose debris to the floor. Rusting equipment lay scattered across a workbench, a barograph with its paper scroll long since rotted, a rain gauge filled with stagnant water. He moved slowly, his gaze sweeping over the derelict interior, a sense of disappointment beginning to set in. What could possibly be here? Then, his foot nudged something. A loose floorboard, slightly raised above its neighbors. Beneath, nestled in the damp earth, was a small, wooden box, bound with tarnished brass fittings. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. This wasn't just a forgotten shed. He pried open the box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age, filled with a spidery, looping script. He carefully lifted it out, the leather cool and dry against his fingers, and carried it closer to the fading light. The first few entries were mundane, observations of weather patterns, notes on crop yields. But then, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more agitated, the words more desperate. He skipped ahead, his eyes scanning for keywords, for anything that made sense of the cabin's horrors. And then he found it. An entry dated nearly 2 centuries ago, penned by a distant ancestor, a man named Elias. The land demands its due. The pact made by my forebears, a foolish bargain struck in ignorance and desperation, now falls to me. The ground beneath this cabin. It is not merely earth. It is a living, dreaming hunger, rooted deeper than any tree. It was a place of reverence, then of burial, long before our kin dared to build upon it. The elder, the one who spoke of the old ways, warned them. They did not listen. They took, they built, they disturbed. The entity, the watcher as the elder called it, is tied to this place, to the very bedrock. It guards what lies beneath, and it demands its sustenance. Our line, through the pact, became its stewards, its feeders. A sacrifice, once every generation, to quiet the hunger, to keep the balance. To ensure the land does not rise. And reclaim what we have stolen. My own blood, a child of my blood, to be given back to the soil, to appease the ancient root, the sleeping horror. Reid have tried to break it, to escape the obligation. It senses my defiance. It will not be denied. My kin, they are lost to it, consumed by its influence, driven mad by its call. Reid must make the offering. May God forgive me. Reid's hands trembled, the journal almost slipping from his grasp. The words swam before his eyes, a horrifying confession, a lineage of sacrifice. The metallic tang in the air wasn't just old blood, it was a promise of fresh. The entity wasn't some wandering spirit, it was the land itself, a malevolent consciousness rooted deep, demanding its due. And he, Reid, was the next in line. Reid's hands still trembled, the journal's confession burning behind his eyes. The cabin wasn't just a structure, it was a living, breathing thing, and he was caught in its suffocating lungs. It was a promise, a scent that clung to the very air, thick and cloying. He felt watched, not by unseen eyes, but by the wood itself, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of fading light, the very silence that pressed against his eardrums. A floorboard groaned upstairs, a deliberate, heavy sound that wasn't the house settling. It was too slow, too purposeful. Reid froze, breath held tight in his chest. He listened, straining for any follow-up, but only the oppressive quiet returned. Then, a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across rough plaster, began in the room directly above him. It wasn't frantic, but rhythmic, a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to mock his stillness. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as rodents, but the methodical nature of the sound, its unwavering tempo, suggested something far more sinister. It was a taunt. Reid swallowed, the dryness in his throat a sudden, painful constriction. He needed to get out, to find a way to make sense of the journal's terrifying entries, to warn his friend. His hand went to his pocket, fumbling for his phone. Dead. He tried the landline, the rotary phone on the dusty table beside the armchair. The line was dead. The cabin wasn't just manifesting, it was isolating him. He felt the walls closing in, the air growing heavier, thick with an unseen presence. He had to leave. He remembered an old, defunct weather station a few miles deeper into the forest, a relic from a bygone era, rumored to have an emergency radio or at least a booster that might catch a stray signal. It was a long walk, but it was his only option. Grabbing his jacket and a small pack, Reid moved towards the front door, his steps careful, his senses on high alert. The scratching upstairs had stopped, replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. The door, which he was certain he'd latched, was ajar, a sliver of deeper gloom visible between the frame and the heavy wood. He pushed it open fully, stepping out into the twilight. Each rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep, each creak of timber, a groan. The path, barely visible in the deepening gloom, seemed to twist and contort before him, an endless tunnel into the unknown. He walked, a frantic urgency pushing him forward, but the forest seemed to resist. Branches snagged at his clothes, roots tripped his feet, and the ground felt strangely uneven, as if the very earth was shifting beneath his boots. It was a small, squat building, mostly corrugated tin and splintered wood, perched on a slight rise. A broken window gaped like an empty eye socket. The door hung precariously on a single hinge, groaning with each gust of wind. He stepped inside, the interior a chaos of decaying equipment, dust, and cobwebs. He approached it cautiously, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The hum grew louder, a low thrum that vibrated in his teeth. He saw a small, leather-bound logbook lying open on the console, its pages brittle with age. He picked it up. The handwriting was faded, but legible. It was scrawled, almost frantic, it knows. It wants the lineage. The pact demands. Reid. The blood drained from his face. The hum from the radio console intensified, growing into a high-pitched whine that grated on his nerves. Suddenly, the ancient speakers crackled to life, not with static, but with a voice. The offering. The pact. The words were an icy claw raking across his mind. This wasn't just a recording, or a trick of the old equipment. He dropped the logbook, stumbling back, his mind reeling. The cabin wasn't just a hungry maw, the forest itself was its throat, and the weather station, its voice. The threat was not just to him, but to his very identity, his lineage, drawing him into a horrifying inheritance he could not escape. He was not just trapped, he was marked. The raw terror of the entity's voice, a discordant symphony echoing his own fears, had paralyzed Reid only for a heartbeat. Then, a primal surge of adrenaline ignited his limbs. He scrambled away from the fallen logbook, its leather cover now seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy on the dusty floorboards. The cabin wasn't merely hungry, it was alive, and it had tasted his fear. Escape. The thought was a desperate, burning ember in his mind. He snatched his backpack, not bothering to be selective, just stuffing whatever came to hand, a flashlight, a half-eaten energy bar, his phone. The screen flickered, no signal, as expected. He cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that had descended on the cabin. He burst through the front door, slamming it behind him with a force that rattled the ancient frame. He plunged into the forest, not bothering with a path, just crashing through undergrowth, driven by a frantic urgency. The trees loomed, skeletal fingers against a bruised sky, their branches clawing at him as he ran. He pushed harder, lungs burning, calves screaming. The world blurred into a green and brown tunnel. He vaguely remembered an old fire trail, a narrow track that led deeper into the woods, but also, eventually, towards the faint possibility of civilization. Relief, sharp and painful, flooded him. This was it. This was his chance. He followed the trail, his pace slowing to a ragged jog, conserving what little energy he had left. Shapes seemed to writhe at the periphery of his vision, gnarled roots transforming into grasping hands, twisted branches into grotesque faces. Then, through a break in the trees, he saw it, a clearing, and in its center, the squat, metallic structure of the old weather station. A beacon of hope, a tangible link to the world beyond this suffocating wilderness. He sprinted the last few yards, his heart hammering against his ribs. The weather station was a small, prefabricated shed, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and green moss. An antenna jutted awkwardly from its roof, a tangle of wires snaking down its side. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb, and pushed the door open. A desk, piled with old logbooks and defunct equipment, sat against one wall. A radio, its casing cracked, was the first thing he saw. He grabbed it, frantically twisting the dials, but it was dead, utterly unresponsive. He tried the landline phone next, its cord severed, dangling like a withered vine. Despair clawed at him, but then his gaze fell on the logbooks. One, in particular, looked older than the rest, its cover of faded, brittle leather. He pulled it out, his fingers tracing the spine. It wasn't a standard weather log. The first few pages were filled with meteorological data, precise and neat. The trees. They watch. A few pages later, September 3rd readings are impossible. Barometer drops to nothing, then spikes. Temperatures fluctuate wildly. And the dreams. The dreams of the root, the hunger. And then, the final entry, smeared in almost illegible, dated nearly a century ago, it knows I see. It reaches. Not just the cabin. The forest. It wants to be fed. The pact. It's real. There is no escape. Not here. Not anywhere. Reid dropped the logbook as if it had burned him. The words were an icy confirmation of his deepest fears. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin, its tendrils spread through the entire forest, a vast, living malignancy. The weather station, a symbol of communication and reason, was just another extension of its domain, a mocking monument to humanity's futile attempts to measure and understand the incomprehensible. He stumbled back out into the clearing, the setting sun now painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and bruised purple. The forest, which had seemed to conspire against him before, now felt actively hostile, the trees leaning in, their branches like bony arms reaching. There was no escape. The realization settled over him with the crushing weight of a tombstone. He was trapped, utterly alone, with an entity that commanded not just the cabin, but the very earth beneath his feet. His mind, already frayed at the edges, began to unravel further, the relentless psychological torment pressing in. He turned, not towards the faint hope of an impossible escape, but back towards the cabin, drawn by an invisible, inescapable tether. Reid couldn't stay in the cabin. The logbook's final entry had branded itself onto his retina, a chilling prophecy of the forest as a living prison. He felt its tendrils, not just metaphorically, but as an actual, subtle pressure against his skin, a hum in the air that tasted of damp earth and something far older than trees. His gaze fell upon an old, faded map tacked to the kitchen wall, a relic from his relative's time, marking a rudimentary trail toward an isolated dot labeled weather station. It was a desperate lead. The cabin, with its creaking timbers and whispering shadows, offered only a suffocating dread now. The journey through the woods was an ordeal. The path, barely discernible, seemed to actively resist him, branches snagging at his clothes, roots like grasping fingers beneath the leaf litter. The trees themselves seemed to watch, their gnarled limbs twisting into grotesque, silent observers. Sunlight, when it pierced the canopy, did so in weak, sickly shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced with an unnerving, almost sentient grace. Reid felt an icy tendril coiling in his gut, a premonition of discovery that warred with the primal urge to flee. Every rustle, every creak of a distant branch, sharpened his senses to a painful degree, his shoulders hunched as if under an invisible weight. Finally, a clearing. And there it stood, the weather station. It was less a building, more a skeletal husk of ambition. A small, square structure of corrugated metal, streaked with rust and peeling paint, leaning precariously on one side. A rusted anemometer, frozen mid-spin, jutted from the roof like a broken finger pointing at a perpetually overcast sky. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from the ceiling, swaying almost imperceptibly as he stepped over the threshold. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, desiccated leaves, and scattered, brittle papers. In the center stood a metal table, scarred and pitted, holding what looked like an ancient, defunct seismograph. Its needle, long since snapped, lay beside a faded, ink-stained logbook, remarkably similar in binding to the one he'd dropped in the cabin. Reid's hands trembled as he reached for it. This logbook was older, its pages yellowed and fragile, the script inside a spidery scrawl that dated back generations. It wasn't about daily observations of wind and rain. It was a record of offerings. He read, his breath catching in his throat. The entries meticulously detailed cycles, lunar phases, and the yield of the forest. Not timber, not game, but energy. The weather station hadn't been built to measure atmospheric conditions, it was a crude instrument, a focal point, designed to track and perhaps even direct something else. The readings weren't barometric pressure, they were fluctuations in a deep, resonant presence beneath the earth, a hunger that pulsed with a slow, ancient rhythm. The blood roaring in his ears drowned out the faint, scratching sounds that seemed to emanate from the walls. The entity wasn't just a spirit or a localized curse. It was a geological being, a primordial consciousness interwoven with the very bedrock of the land, a vast, subterranean organism that had awakened eons ago. Its tendrils were not just metaphorical, they were actual, energetic conduits that permeated the soil, the roots of the trees, and, terrifyingly, the bloodline of his family. The logbook detailed the pact. His ancestors hadn't just settled here, they had stumbled upon this vast, dormant thing and, in their ignorance or desperation, had inadvertently roused it. To survive, to thrive on its land, they had made a bargain, a lineage of caretakers, a promise to provide sustenance when the hunger stirred. And the sustenance wasn't crops or livestock. It was life. The specific demands were horrifyingly clear, a sacrifice, a renewal, every few generations. Not just a life, but a life connected to the land. A life, perhaps, of their own. Reid stumbled back, knocking over a rusted bucket, the clang echoing like a gunshot. The details, sparse but damning, painted a picture of a ritual, a convergence of energy, and a terrible transference. The entity didn't want to be appeased, it wanted to be fed. And the logbook implied that the relative whose death had brought him here had been the last offering, but it hadn't been enough. The entity was still hungry. It was starving. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the concrete floor, rising from the very earth beneath his feet. The cobwebs, which had merely swayed, now began to twitch violently, as if stirred by an invisible wind. He looked down at the logbook again, his eyes scanning the final, frantic entries. The breach. It demands more. A stronger vessel. A final harvest. The words blurred, but the implication was stark, sickening. The entity wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming him. He wasn't just the heir, he was the next course. The sacrifice required wasn't something to be offered, it was something to be taken. And it wanted not just his life, but his essence, to fully integrate and complete its ancient, monstrous cycle. The weather station hummed, a low, predatory sound, confirming the truth of his discovery, the forest outside pressing in, a living, breathing maw. The wind at the abandoned weather station howled like a banshee, tearing at the rusty corrugated metal siding and rattling the single, grimy windowpane. Reid hunched over the splintered workbench, a tattered, water-stained map spread before him, illuminated by the beam of his flickering flashlight. He had come here, driven by a half-remembered scrawl in the logbook, a note about old instruments and unseen frequencies. It was a desperate gamble, a last gasp of logic in a world that had abandoned it. The station was a skeleton of its former purpose, perched on a barren ridge miles from the cabin. Equipment lay strewn, corroded, and useless. But hidden beneath a loose floorboard, precisely where the logbook hinted, he had found it, not an instrument, but a small, heavy wooden box, lined with lead, containing a single, tarnished silver compass and a tightly rolled parchment. The parchment was old, brittle, covered in symbols that mirrored those he'd seen carved into the cabin's foundation. It wasn't a map, not in the traditional sense, but a ritual diagram, detailing specific movements, specific offerings, and a terrifyingly specific moment. The compass, however, was the true horror. It didn't point north. Its needle quivered, erratically, then settled, fixed on a point directly back towards the cabin. And as he held it, the silver grew warm, then hot, almost burning his palm. He understood then. The relative hadn't been observing the weather, he had been observing the pact, trying to chart its insidious spread, hoping to find a weakness in its frequency. A wave of nausea washed over Reid. The air in the weather station, already stale with dust and decay, suddenly felt heavy, charged. A low hum, like the vibration of massive, distant machinery, resonated in his teeth. The entity knew. It had let him find this, lured him into believing he had an advantage. It wanted him to return. His return journey to the cabin was a blur of heightened senses and primal fear. The forest, once a comforting expanse of green, had become a labyrinth of grasping shadows. Branches scraped against his jacket like skeletal fingers. The ground, slick with damp earth, seemed to pull at his boots, eager to claim him. He could taste the metallic tang of ozone on the air, mixed with the damp, cloying scent of decaying leaves and something else, something ancient and putrid, like unearthed soil from a tomb. When the cabin finally emerged from the deepening gloom, it was no longer the rustic structure he had inherited. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green light emanating from within, like a monstrous heart beating in the chest of the woods. The porch sagged further, planks groaning under an unseen weight. The very air around it shimmered, distorting the trees beyond into wavering specters. He pushed open the heavy oak door. It didn't creak, it sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation. Inside, the cabin was a nightmare made tangible. The furniture was overturned, splintered. The fireplace was choked with a black, oily residue that pulsed with the same green light. Tendrils of shadow stretched from the corners, reaching, withdrawing, like restless appendages. The hum he'd felt at the weather station was deafening here, vibrating through the very floorboards, rattling his bones. Reid clutched the silver compass, its heat a constant reminder of the pact. He unfolded the parchment, his hands trembling, and began to move. The ritual wasn't about banishing. It was about severing. About acknowledging the ancient debt, not by paying it, but by cutting the lineage, by making an ultimate stand. He followed the diagram, placing the compass at the central point, its needle now spinning wildly, reflecting the green glow. He felt eyes on him, 1,000 unseen gazes pressing down, crushing the air from his lungs. Fool! You cannot break what binds. The cabin itself began to twist. The ceiling stretched, then sagged, timbers groaning in agony. He saw figures in the periphery of his vision, not solid, but impressions, echoes of past sacrifices, a woman weeping, a child's terrified shriek, a man's silent, resigned plea. They were the faces of his ancestors, caught in the entity's eternal snare, their suffering feeding its power. He forced himself to continue, chanting the guttural syllables from the parchment, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the cabin's growing roar. The silver compass at the center of the diagram began to glow brighter, a pure white light pushing back against the green. He felt a searing pain, as if his own blood was being drawn into the ritual, his very essence offered as a counter-sacrifice. Suddenly, the entity manifested. Not as a beast, not as a phantom, but as an overwhelming, crushing presence. It wasn't a shape, but a distortion of reality itself. The air grew impossibly dense, pressing against him, threatening to flatten him to the floor. A vision exploded in his mind, not of the past, but of the future. He saw himself, an empty husk, his eyes vacant, standing guard over the cabin, a new link in the chain of sacrifice. This was the true nature of the pact, not just blood, but being. The entity didn't just want a life, it wanted a guardian, a host, an eternal servant to tend its prison. The entity wasn't invincible. It was bound. Bound by the very pact it enforced. It needed the lineage, needed the living connection to this place. And the compass, now glowing fiercely, pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored his own heart. The ritual wasn't to break the pact, but to redirect it. To sever the lineage, yes, but also to trap the entity, to turn its own binding against itself. The ultimate sacrifice wasn't his life, but his connection. He lunged, grabbing the compass, the white light searing his hand. The cessation was not a sudden silence, but a violent snapping of tension, like a stretched cable finally giving way. Reid found himself crumpled on the floorboards, a fine dust stinging his nostrils and coating his tongue. The cacophony of groaning timbers and ripping plaster had ceased, replaced by an oppressive quiet that pressed against his eardrums. His head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind his eyes, and a sharp pain lanced through his ribs with every shallow breath. He lay there for a long moment, unwilling to move, unwilling to open his eyes, terrified of what the world might have become. The green light, which had pulsed with such malevolent intensity, had receded, leaving only the weak, gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's warped windows. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself up, his muscles protesting with a chorus of aches. The cabin was changed. Not utterly destroyed, but scarred, twisted. The ceiling, though no longer actively rippling, sagged in the center, a vast, spiderweb crack bisecting its length. Walls bowed inward, their wallpaper peeled back in strips, revealing raw timber beneath, splintered and stained as if by some internal pressure. The very air felt different, thinner, vibrating with a residual hum of unspoken wrongness. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the gritty film of dust, the tremor in his fingers. His clothes were torn, caked with grime. A long, shallow gash marred his forearm, seeping sluggish red. The figures. The old wooden table was overturned, its legs snapped. The armchair where he'd spent so many uneasy nights was ripped, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. It was a wreck, yes, but it was still a cabin. It hadn't been consumed, not entirely. But the cost. He looked around, searching. The old family Bible, which had been on the mantel, was gone. Not merely knocked down, but vanished. The small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from his mother, was also missing from its perch on the windowsill. These were small things, physical objects, easily replaced. But the true cost was less tangible. He caught his reflection in a shard of glass still clinging to a window pane. His jaw was set, etched with a grim determination, but also a profound weariness that seemed to age in decades. He had survived, but he had not emerged unscathed. A piece of him, a fundamental belief in the solidity of the world, had been irrevocably chipped away. He pushed through the debris-strewn doorway, stepping out into the cool, damp air of the forest. The trees stood sentinel, their branches dripping with morning dew, utterly oblivious to the horror that had unfolded within the cabin's walls. He began to walk aimlessly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. He needed to confirm his reality, to touch something undeniably human-made. Through the dense canopy, a glint of metal, a distant, familiar shape, caught his eye. The old, disused weather station. It was miles away, but it represented a tether to the world he knew, or thought he knew. The journey was a blur of strained muscles and panicked glances over his shoulder. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He imagined eyes watching him from the undergrowth, not the eyes of animals, but something far older, far more patient. He was certain the entity, or its remnants, were still out there, lurking, waiting. The forest felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a vast, silent witness to his ordeal. When he finally stumbled out of the tree-line, gasping for breath, the weather station stood before him. It was a small, ramshackle structure of corrugated iron and faded paint, its anemometer long since seized by rust. A single, small solar panel glinted dully on its roof. It was deserted, neglected, but it was real. He pressed his palm against the cool, rough metal of its wall, feeling the undeniable solidity of it. But even here, miles from the cabin, the sense of an unseen presence clung to him. He looked back towards the distant, hidden tree-line where the cabin lay. It was no longer just a house, it was a scar on the landscape, a wound in reality. The world had irrevocably shifted on its axis, and he along with it. The cacophony of groaning timbers and ripping plaster had ceased, replaced by a vacuum of sound that felt heavier, more oppressive, than any shriek that had come before. His muscles screamed with a dull ache he hadn't registered until that precise moment of stillness. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow, tasting of old wood and something metallic, something like the tang of fear itself. He pushed himself up, his limbs protesting. The cabin was still, but it was a different kind of still. He scanned the room, his eyes darting from the splintered doorframe to the cracked hearth, to the bare patch on the wall where the last image had manifested. There was no visible damage beyond the usual decay, no gaping maw on the floorboards, no spectral residue clinging to the air. Yet, every fiber of his being screamed that something monumental had transpired. The air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean of the malevolent weight that had pressed down on him for weeks, leaving behind only a profound emptiness. The cabin was quiet, yes, but not empty. He understood now. The pact, the lineage, the sacrifices, it was all a grim tapestry woven into the very foundations of this place, into the bloodline he carried. The entity, whatever nameless hunger it possessed, had been sated, for now, but the cost. The cost was seared into him. The knowledge he now carried was a burden, a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders, forever altering the way he perceived the world. The mundane no longer felt mundane, it was a thin veil over something vast and terrifying. He had to leave. He couldn't stay another moment in this place that had become a tomb for his peace of mind. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath as he emerged, the sunlight, usually a comfort, now felt alien, almost mocking. He walked, not knowing where he was going, only that it had to be away. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. His legs ached, his throat was parched, but he pushed on, driven by an instinct beyond exhaustion. The forest, dense and unforgiving, gradually began to thin, giving way to a more managed landscape, though still wild. Then, through a break in the canopy, he saw it, a skeletal tower of metal, gleaming faintly in the afternoon sun. Beneath it, a small, prefabricated structure, painted a faded institutional green. A weather station. He stumbled towards it, drawn by the stark contrast of its utilitarian purpose against the primeval horror he'd endured. The small building was unlocked, surprisingly. Inside, a console hummed softly, a bank of screens displaying graphs and numbers. Anemometers spun lazily outside, their rotations recorded with precise, indifferent accuracy. A low, rhythmic tick-tick-tick emanated from a barometer on the wall. He sank onto a metal stool, resting his head against the cool, smooth surface of a data cabinet. He had untangled the knot, or so he believed, severing the link, breaking the cycle. He had survived, yes, but he was no longer the same man who had arrived at the cabin. He stayed at the weather station until dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The instruments continued their tireless work, measuring wind speed, humidity, atmospheric pressure, tangible, quantifiable forces. Yet, Reid knew there were other forces, immeasurable and ancient, that influenced the very fabric of existence, forces that had almost consumed him. As he finally rose to leave, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. He paused, turning slowly. The small, reflective surface of a blank monitor screen caught his eye. But for a fleeting instant, just before he blinked, he thought he saw something else in those depths, a flicker of something ancient, something hungry, lingering behind his own eyes. A subtle shift in the light, perhaps, or merely the trick of an exhausted mind. He had walked away from the cabin, but he hadn't walked away unscathed. He was free, but the world was no longer safe, and neither, he suspected, was he.